Welcome to a new episode of Books to Last. This episode I'm joined by Raye from the Being Bookish podcast as she shares the 5 books she would be cast away with. All books discussed in this episode are listed in the podcast description, so please go and check that out as this episode may contain spoilers. Welcome to Books to Last, the podcast that challenges readers to pick the only 5 books they may take with them when cast away to a mystery remote location. As ever, I'm joined by a book-loving guest, and this episode I'm joined by Raye. Welcome, Raye, to the podcast. It's so great to have you on.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, what brings you onto the podcast? Tell me about you and books and reading.
I am an obsessive reader. I mean, so obsessive. I used to share a room with my sister when I was younger, and it reached the point where my mum gave up on trying to stop me from reading at night because I would literally be reading through the night books that probably weren't quite appropriate. My mum just gave my sister an eye mask because she knew there was no point in asking me to stop reading. That's how bad I was, and I've been like that since I probably learned to read.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, except no one seemed to actually notice that I was reading through the night until there was one particular day when I was reading, I think it was Pride and Prejudice, the first time I'd read Pride and Prejudice, and I was up until about 5:30 in the morning finishing it. And I remember checking my phone or clock at 5:30 in the morning and going, oh my God, I need to be up in a few hours, and then going back to sleep and then waking up and checking my phone again. It was a 12-hour clock and it said 5 o'clock, and I was like, have I gone back in time? I had like the strangest like mind blank, and then I realized that it was 5 o'clock, like 5 p.m. the next day. And I think I was rumbled from that moment on because that had never happened before. But yeah, always.
No, mine was more, I was reading, I think, Stephen King's It. I was 13, and my mum, I was a very, my mum gave, our local library had this thing where you had a brown ticket when you were a child, and when you were upgraded to an adult ticket, it was green. And if your parents wrote to the library, you could get a green ticket. And my mum gave me a letter to give to the library when I was 10 to give me a green ticket, getting me out of the kids section because I wasn't interested in Enid Blyton. So I was introduced to the wonder of all the big books, Penny Vincenzi, Barbara Taylor Bradford, Linda LaPlante, and Stephen King. And I would just pick up a book, take it home with me, and then take it back to the library after I'd read it as quick as possible. So one night I was reading it, which is over 1,000 pages, and I didn't even realize that. And my mum came in to get me up to go to school, and I hadn't gone to sleep. And that was when she realized that there was a problem. But even before that, she asked my grandmother to hide any books that she was reading, so I didn't just pick them up in the middle of a family event and go off and read somewhere. So yeah, I've always had a bit of a problem with reading, though I don't think it's a problem.
It's not a problem. I always reference I had a high school biology teacher, and in my yearbook he wrote, best of luck with everything, keep on reading, brackets, yes, I did see you reading in the back of all of my lessons.
Well, it wasn't a subject that interested you, as long as you took the basics.
Yeah, it absolutely wasn't. And the thing is, I think he knew I was probably going to revise enough to pass the exam, which was probably all he really needed me to do. But he never once pulled me up on it. I never once got told off in any of his lessons for reading books that were obviously not science related, and he's absolutely one of my favorite teachers of all time for that very reason, and because I had no idea he had any idea that I was reading in the back of his lessons until he wrote that in my book. So yeah, it's a great, I think reading is good. I don't think it's a bad thing to be obsessive reader.
No, that's it. It was my birthday back in February, and all my family ask me, what do you want for your birthday? And I create an Amazon wish list with all the books on it that I really want, that I haven't got around to buying for myself at that point. Normally it doesn't last on the list very long because I'll give in and just buy it anyway. But my family was like, what do you want for your birthday? And I said, my Amazon wish list. And I got the feedback, oh, well, I don't want to buy you books. And I'm thinking, then why ask me what I want for my birthday if you don't like the answer? And it ended up that my sister did buy me 5 of the books on my reading list because she couldn't think of anything else to get me.
I have this every single Christmas. My entire in-law family asks me, okay, so what do you want for Christmas? And I'm like, books. And they go, yeah, but apart from books. And I'm like, more books.
Yeah.
Just like, I have a very long list of books that I want. I'm never going to actually be able to buy them all or have like be finished with my list of books that I want to read. So I'm just like, just buy me more of them. There's a very long list of them. My husband has access to the list if you feel better if he supplies it with you instead of me giving it to you myself. But yeah, it's every single year. It's what do you want? Books. Apart from that, just books is fine. Multiple books if you feel like it's not enough.
Exactly. And when people say, but isn't there anything else? It's like, but if I want something else, I'm an adult and I can buy it. There are certain things that I will put on a list, like paperweights. I collect Kate and S crystal paperweights. They're the sort of thing that I won't buy for myself.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I like the idea of getting books because while they have to look at my list rather than just impulsively buy one because otherwise they might get me something I've already purchased, it's a personal gift.
Yeah. I think on occasion in the past I've kind of got people to, I suppose if you give them a long enough list, they can probably see what they like the look of. I always find there's almost kind of fun thinking, even if you give them quite a large selection, seeing what people are drawn to give you, like
Yeah.
what they think looks like a good book out of all the ones that you've picked. I always think that's really quite kind of fun. And I also sometimes I'll look at my list and I'll go, I think I know which of these books this person's going to buy me. So my a good friend Leah bought me 2 books off of my list for my birthday earlier this year, and I 100% knew that she was going to buy me one of them because I'd looked at my list recently and I'd seen that I'm Glad My Mom Died by
Jeanette McCurdy.
Yeah, was on that list, and I just knew that she would find that title so almost humorous and like provocative. I was like, she's 100% gonna pick. I know she's gonna pick that one for me because she's gonna look at that whole list and that one is just gonna call to her. And she did. She absolutely got me. I was like, this is great. I'm so glad I know my friends so well. But yes, anyway, so what was the last great book that you read? I mean, recently.
The last great book I've read, that's the thing, I've read so many really good books this year. Really good books. I think last year I read 4 5-star books. 4. And I read 160 books or something, and I read 4 5 stars. I even read a 1 star. Yeah, we don't need to touch that one. That's going to be part of a charity event that I do where I read bad sex scenes out for money, raising charity money for cancer. But I read this year, I think oh God, it's so difficult to say one book that I've read that's really good. However, I'd say Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati is probably the best book I've read this year so far.
Oh, well, I mean, we're in April, so I'm hoping you get more than 4 5-star books.
I've already got 5 5-star reads this year.
Already a better reading year.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that a 4-star read is bad. It's just that it didn't get me the same way as a 5-star read.
The 5-star ones are the ones that you keep thinking about, even in unrelated circumstances, days, weeks later. And I have had an occasion where I've like finished a book, and because I've had mixed feelings about the ending, I've almost thought it was only a 4-star, but because it keeps on sort of staying with me later on, I'm like, I almost feel like I need to upgrade this to a 5-star because it's living rent-free in my head in completely unrelated circumstances.
That's the thing. I mean, it's really difficult to say I can pick one 5-star read that I've had this year, because I also read Godkiller by Hannah Kaner, which was
I've heard good
incredible.
things.
I'm not normally a massive fan of pure fantasy like that, but that one was an incredible debut. I mean, to be honest, both of those have been debut novels, and they were, I'd say, both fantastic.
Nothing is more excited than like a really strong debut novel. It always makes me just like deeply happy. I mean, don't get me wrong, all good books sort of make me really happy, but like when it's the first one out the gate as well, it's almost like, oh, it's really exciting because I'm always like, I want to know what comes after this.
Exactly. It makes me a bit nervous for what's going to come after it, because even when you've read a 5-star book in your own opinion, you then look at the next book you're going to read with a tiny bit of dread. Is this going to live up to it? And I've read a few this year that have been not the most amazing novel. And I don't know if it's because I read them after something very, very good, or because it just wasn't a very good novel.
Yeah, it's hard because I mean that's the other. I've heard some other readers say that 5-star books are the books that make you almost want to redefine your rating system because it feels like they're that good.
Oh, absolutely. I've lost count of the number of times I've looked at my past reads and thought, on Goodreads, and thought, should I start re-rating my books?
It's really hard because I often find that like even just 2 weeks removed from a book, I almost feel not completely differently, but like once I've cooled off from the immediate hangover from it, I sometimes have to like the objective part of my mind comes in and sort of goes, oh well, maybe in the heat of the moment, either for better or for worse, I was either more generous or more harsh than I would be now, and it's quite difficult because it is something. It's like it's cross-sectional, isn't it? It's a moment in time.
Exactly. That is what's really hard. However, because the Clytemnestra, which I read, I think I read it for the first time as a NetGalley arc, and I read it in, I want to say, February, and I loved it so much. It was like pre-order, and the special edition in Waterstones is stunning, I have to say. But I then reread it again when it came out, and my feelings for the book were exactly the same as they had been when I read it the first time. So I thought, yes, I was right in giving this a 5-star review.
That's great. It's great when it's the same, and almost like I think you kind of sometimes with a great book you get to enjoy it almost even more the second time because you get to pick up on the details that you sort of sometimes stumble over in the initial first read. Because I get really, when I'm really enjoying a book, I get sort of almost frantic with the reading thing, and I sometimes miss details as I get more and more absorbed in it. So I do like to reread and pick up those extra details and stuff.
Yeah, I do reread quite a few, especially if I read them as an arc and then I get a copy of it myself.
Feels
And
different
that
in
is
hands.
that is the sign for me, though. If I read a book and I have to buy it, I know that I liked it enough to buy it.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. So, as mentioned before, you are going to be cast away to a mystery remote location with the only 5 books you get to take with you. As ever, you get to pick where you get to be cast away to because we don't, force people to go to desert islands on the podcast. Do you have an idea in mind of where you'd want to be cast away to? Anywhere in particular?
I'd like somewhere with a turquoise blue ocean and white sand, because I like sand. I'm not a massive fan of snow and rain, have to be honest. I don't know whether that's through living in a very cold country as a teenager or because I live in England, which is notoriously a wet country. But I want somewhere that is going to be warm and sunny, but not so sunny that I burn, because I'm very, very fair-skinned.
Very important.
But are we going to get an emergency kit that contains sunscreen?
Yes, so wherever you get cast away to furnishes for all your provisions, including unlimited sunscreen and any treats and food that you want on tap. We had somebody specifically request that pumpkin spice lattes be never ending in their particular location.
No, chai. I'd have to have chai. I gave up coffee, so it has to be tea and spiced chai. But yeah, I think it would have to be a desert island, but somewhere that had a beautiful turquoise ocean with no sharks.
that can easily be arranged. We create our own geography on the podcast, and people invent their own countries if necessary. So, with the location in mind, what is the first book that you're going to take with you to your actual desert island, which doesn't happen very often?
My first book is actually a book I have read every year since 1986.
Amazing.
And that is The Changeover by Margaret Mahy. It is a YA novel, and the subtitle of it is A Supernatural Romance. And I have to be honest, it is a book that it was partially a comfort because it came out when I was 12, and that's a hard year for anybody. Being 12 is horrible. I don't know if it's only horrible for girls, but it's horrible.
It's definitely more horrible for girls.
So I found this book the first time in my school library, and I took it out so often that when it came back because somebody else had read it, the librarian, Mrs. Bennison at my school library, would put it behind the counter because she knew that I'd need it again as a comfort book. And then I bought my own copy in 1987, and it's falling apart because I read it so often. So I bought myself, it went out of print for a while, and I bought myself another copy. And then they released another cover, so I bought that copy as well. And then they made a film of it, and I wanted to gouge my eyes out because what they'd done was destroyed the stories. Essentially, it's about this teenage girl in New Zealand who lives with her mother and her younger brother, Jacko. And Laura, the female character, is very awkward and uncomfortable, but she's what they would call a sensitive. So she's halfway between witch and human, or witch and mortal. And they go into this little store, her and her brother one day go into this little junk store owned by a man called Carmody Brack. And her brother is stamped with this little stamp thing and starts getting sick. And it turns out that Carmody Brack is a succubus who is draining the energy of her younger brother. So she goes to the witch family, the Carlisle family in the town, which is made up of a mother and grandmother and a son, which is very unusual. His name's Sorensen, and they call him Sorry. And it turns out that Sorry has been watching Laura for a very long time because he's fascinated with her. And together they are going to save her brother by getting rid of the demon. And to do so, she has to conduct a changeover to become a fully fledged witch. And that's what the story is about. And it's just one of those books. It's really short, but it's one of those books that I can read over and over again with no problem.
And it's got all the trappings of a classic paranormal romance YA fantasy.
But it was written way before these others were. Yeah.
the one of the original.
Yeah, exactly. It really was one of the originals, and it's the book that made me really want to read more romance, strangely enough.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that they've made an adaptation. I always have to refer to them as adaptions because they're almost never actual.
Oh, they've made it so dark and so unlike the book that they could have called it something different, and I'd have been really happy.
Well, I always like when people start with like a comfort read or a read that they've read thing. I think the idea of like books, especially when it's the original sort of copy that sort of is read over and over again, it's one of the reasons that I feel like I gravitate more towards secondhand bookstores and that sort of thing, because I feel like books that have been read that many times and loved that many times have got like a character to them. So it's really amazing that you obviously had your copy that you read so much. I'm hoping some of my copies manage to last as long.
I've got books that my mum gave me that she won at school.
They have great staying power. What is the sort of special? What's the new edition that you've bought of it? Just out of curiosity, does it?
The new edition I've bought of it is it's not special. It's just because my other copies were falling apart. It has a nice cover to it, which is very reflective of the original feel of the book. and it's just slightly more sturdy than my copy that is from 1987, so it's nearing 40 years old and has been read so many times. The pages smell incredible because old books always do,
Yes.
but it is legitimately falling apart to the point that I don't want to open it because I know that one more read is going to be its final read.
Well, when they make a museum to the true hero of sort of paranormal romance, you never know, it may end up being a relic
Yeah, that's the
in
thing.
100 years' time.
I find it quite sad that it's such an obscure book because it's not in the same kind of vein as YA now.
Yeah, it's a shame because it's not one that I've ever heard of myself either. And I mean, I read a lot of the sort of onslaught of, the paranormal, which then sort of morphed into dystopian YA novels with the romance
I
element that ran through all of
I
them.
think it's because it's older.
Yeah, which is a shame. It really should. It needs a TikTok style resurgence like some of the other backlist books that
Yeah,
have been.
absolutely, but it's not a very long book either, and there's no option for it to become a series because sadly the author has passed away. So maybe that's another reason.
I mean, nowadays, short books that are standalones are usually a huge selling point because people can't afford to commit to any more series.
That is
So
true.
honestly, it's got nothing but good going for it from the sounds of it, and a great way to start your list.
You can't have it. You
So
can't
what
help
is
Old Faithful.
Yeah, well, you've got to have that comfort book, and almost always at least one comfort book in all of the lists. So it's really great that we get to continue that forward. What is the second book that will be joining in the changeover with you?
Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I'm guessing many people have probably mentioned it at some point. It's one of those. My copy is from when they first came out. It has got a very interesting and unusual cover, and it is like a lot of my other books, so well read it's falling apart.
They're the best kinds. Terry Pratchett. So I am actually almost disappointed that. Well, no, I am not almost. I am disappointed that Terry Pratchett has not featured more on the podcast. I clearly need to shop more in the Terry Pratchett
I
reading
asked my
area.
mum what she would take, and her first book was Nation by Terry Pratchett.
Well, he's got such an impressive, like, it's just there's so many, and they're all so loved for such individual reasons. We've had some recent guests on the podcast who did pick Terry Pratchett books, and they're just so fun to talk about, and they're like the colors, like just the covers, they stay in my mind so much because they're just iconic, like the original sort of illustrated covers
Yeah.
for Terry Pratchett. Why Good Omens specifically for you?
It's one of those books I like the gelling of the two writers. You can tell that it's Neil Gaiman, who obviously before he'd done this had written he'd created some works for Constantine and Lucifer for DC Comics, and you can see his writing in the book. But you can also see Terry Pratchett in there. They're two very different writers who worked incredibly well together to create Aziraphale and Crowley as separate characters that just work together. And there's something so satirical about the entire book. I enjoy it because it's fun, but there's also elements of it in there that are quite dark without being seen as incredibly dark.
Well, that's Terry Pratchett's sort of signature style, isn't it? Satire that is almost jolly in its delivery, but when you actually look at the sort of true, messages and stuff behind it, a lot of it is based on sort of really. It can go into sort of really dark areas, or
Yeah.
it's speaking to something very real in the real world, which it's almost easy to forget because of the fantastical sort of.
And I think the religious aspect that's in there is very Neil Gaiman because you have
Oh, he's
exactly because you've got American Gods and House at the End of the Ocean at the End of the Lane and everything else. All of those books have a slightly religious bent to them.
Yeah, and Sandman similarly has like the Sandman. sort of mythology that he
Yes,
created has got, it's all sort of threads. It's true what you say. They work, like everyone I know who think it agrees that they sort of, as two authors, their styles go together so well, and they actually
yeah,
work together really well, which isn't always the case when two authors co-write a book.
no,
I've read some where they're not bad books, but it's patently obvious that they were written by two separate people.
absolutely.
Because
This one's
yeah,
seamless.
yeah, and it's just, I mean, it's definitely one of the most famous, isn't it, for that particular reason. I mean, we've mentioned adaptations for previous books. What do you think of the adaptation of this one, the most recent one, I suppose?
I think it was a very well done because of I think partially because of the casting, which
Mm,
was incredibly well chosen. I mean, David Tennant and Michael Sheen together are, you can tell that they're very good friends, but there were elements of their kind of snideness towards each other that was personal but also scripted. And I enjoyed that. I
yeah,
think that it was very cleverly done, but the book is very clever. So they're working from incredibly good source material.
yeah,
And the fact that Neil Gaiman had actually worked on it as well
yeah.
meant that someone was looking after it.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's true what you're saying. Good source material, and it's good that they had both had good source material and used the good sourse material, because there
Yes.
have been a lot of people out there who've had
Because,
good source material and just ignored it.
yes, I can look at the changeover to determine that one.
Yeah, yeah. To name but one.
There's quite a few.
um. So I mean, Good Omens, obviously one that a lot of people are really familiar with, and it's always great to add more voices to another recommendation for it. It's not, so it's one that I still need to read. It is very high on my list because I actually hadn't really come into contact with Terry Pratchett, not out of any conscious choice, but because it's not one that I'd read. And I read a graphic novel adaptation of Small Gods
Yeah.
towards the end of last year. And it was like the first taste I ever had of his writing. And I was almost hitting myself that I'd never actually like read one of his novels, because even what had been, what limited amount had been chosen and used for the graphic novel adaptation was just, I just laughed endlessly.
Yeah, that's one thing. I
Everything.
think that Good Omens is a funny book, but it's also got moments where that make you think.
Yeah.
And I think, and that is the strength of both of those authors' work.
Yeah, and again, another amazing choice to take with you on your desert island. What is the third book that we'll be adding to this sort of almost kind of spooky?
This one's not spooky.
Okay.
My third one is a classic, which actually I have a strange history with, and that's Pride and Prejudice.
Ah, a a podcast favorite.
Yeah, I have a strange history with it because I read it for my GCSEs and hated it.
So I read it for my GCSE
Absolutely,
and adored it.
absolutely. Yeah, I absolutely hated it when I read it for my GCSEs. I wasn't feeling receptive to the whole thing. And I can remember actually sitting, and it's probably still on the desk in our school, in our old school library, sitting there and scrawling in pencil on the desk, I hate Jane Austen. I really, really hated this book when I
Blasphemy.
read it for the first time.
Okay, so what made you give it a second chance then? Because I hated many books I learnt at school, and I have not been as gracious as you to give them a second chance.
I think that it was reading it again when I did my A levels when I obviously at 18, and then I went off, wasn't happy with my grades, went off and lived in Austria for a year, and then came back and resat my A levels. And Pride and Prejudice was a book, a text in the year that I resat my A levels, and reading it for myself, I think I appreciated it far more, and I was able to see. I In a way, I think I'd blame the teaching and the way that they taught it at school, because when I read it for myself, even though I was reading it for my A levels, I saw the satire in it. I
Mm,
saw the sarcasm and the commentary, the social commentary that Jane Austen is so well known for, and realized that I'd missed all of this because it hadn't been something we were looking for. So the more I read of it, the more I saw, and then I decided to pick up Emma and Northanger Abbey, which is another of my favorites. And the more I read, the more I could see that actually she wasn't writing, "Oh, Mr. Willoughby." She was writing, "Oh my God, really? Own yourself, mate. You're so done." And
Yeah.
I could see that as somebody who was a little bit older and not being force-fed the standardized teaching method. I could see something different in the book. And then, of course, came the 1995 version with Colin Firth, and it was like, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the teaching of English literature texts is kind of the make or break of them. I mean, I have a rocky relationship with Shakespeare, for that same reason, because I felt that the way a lot of the Shakespeare I was taught, because I was taught many of his plays during my time at school, my feelings towards those particular plays are entirely dependent on the teacher who taught them to me,
Mm.
because yeah, truly, like, it completely comes down to that. And I mean, I was quite lucky that, I suppose, our English literature teacher for Pride and Prejudice was very hands off, so he actually kind of let us take what we wanted from the text. And but I do think where you're at in your own life with, I think, probably all books ever, but I
Yeah.
mean Jane Austen in particular, it makes a big difference to what you take from it. Because I mean, I read it for the first time when I was 15, and all I wanted was to be Lizzie Bennet, because I just thought she was the coolest, most amazing heroine who basically didn't care what anyone thought, and she just did her own thing no matter what. And I thought that was great, because I definitely was not that person. And then rereading it more recently after I'd sort of got married and become a mother, and I was like, I had like this completely different reading of it. Not necessarily that I didn't like Lizzie Bennet anymore, but all of a sudden I was completely entranced by the married couples in the book. And I just found, like, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, I just found their every interaction hilarious. It felt like comedy gold, because it was almost like I was seeing it through a completely different lens, having
Yeah, I
been
think
married for a couple of years at that
that's
point.
where I saw it, because I
Yeah.
saw, obviously, I think that people who read it now for the first time have an advantage in the materials they've got as a resource with the 1995 version and the 2005, which I don't even want to talk about because I hated. Did not
It's a
like.
real, it's an opinion
It's
divide.
divisive. That is a massively divisive one. I wasn't hugely keen on Keira Knightley as Lizzie Bennet. Uh, sorry to anybody who liked her. But the 1995 version obviously didn't exist when I went to school, because I graduated in 1990. So 5 years before the 1995 version was made, and I did my A-levels in 93 as a retake. So it still didn't exist. So I didn't have that source material to look at and go, oh, well, I can see what she was doing. So it was completely reliant on my teacher, who was intent on talking about the societal niceties of it. Very, very much the same as I had an English when I was doing my A-levels for the second time, and we also read Jane Eyre, and my English teacher was obsessed with the color red in reference to the book and Bertha. It's like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. I'm not paying attention to you anymore. So it was kind of mixed bag, but when I reread it for myself, I enjoyed it far more because I got more out of it.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And yeah, like I say, Pride and Prejudice, it's an interesting one, because I always like to know why people love Pride and Prejudice, because a lot of people who've been on the podcast do, but we've had a very even mix of people who read it first and fell in love with the book, or watched the 2005 adaptation and fell in love with that, and then went and read the book afterwards, and then people whose introduction was the 1995 version and then they went back and read it. And I always find it's always something. People take so many different things away from Pride and Prejudice, and I just think it's one of the reasons why it's it's the classic that he is. So
Yeah.
yeah, definitely one of my favorites, and probably one of the books that I will have. Yeah, probably one of the books that I will have falling
But I
apart
bet
on
many
me.
people haven't come on and said, "I hated it."
No, definitely not. I mean, I mean, I've got classics that I hate, and I'm glad I didn't have to study at school because I've read them more recently, and I thought, oh my god, if I'd been forced to read this and then pull apart quotes from it, I think I would have struggled. But I was very, very lucky with Pride and Prejudice. It's not so lucky with some of my other English literature books, which
Yeah. Did you have to read Jude the Obscure?
no, I had to read Of Mice and Men, which I did. I hate John Steinbeck. I hate everything he writes. I've tried, but I hate it. And then it's because of the time period he writes in. It's the depression, and there's a reason for it. And I just don't. I'm not. It's just not for me. And Atonement by Ian McEwan, which I had someone comment on my review of it on Goodreads, telling me that I was almost basically correcting me in my opinion. That basically I was
But your
wrong to
opinion's your
dislike it for the
opinion, and
reason
that's
that I
it.
did. Actually, the reason I disliked it should have been the reason that I liked it. That was that was the takeaway I got from it. And I saw it and I was like, I don't think I need to respond to this.
People are quite protective of their favorite books, though, I think, and that does come across in the comments and responses that people give to a review. I'm always really nervous when I do a review on the podcast, and I know that it's not going to be massively popular because
Yeah.
I did an episode ages ago that was the countdown of the top 5 1990s early 2000s TV shows with teen characters in, and Buffy was at number 5. And I was like, I'm going to duck and cover
Right.
because
Right.
that opinion's not going to be popular. But then I also didn't like The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. And I was waiting for people to come at me for that one.
Yeah, so it's on the shelf behind me. It is gonna get read, but because it's a series, I'm basically doing what I do with all series, and I'm waiting until it's finished, and then I'm gonna read it.
You're going to
In
be waiting
that
a while, I
format.
think.
Well, it's one of those, I basically with any series, on the off chance that I fall in love with it and cannot stand to wait for the next book, I have to kind of almost have the insurance plan that I have at least the next one, if not all of them, um, at least out in publication, if not already on my shelf. But then that also gives me the option of, if I read the first one, I have no interest in the rest, I basically get to just strike like 3 to 5 books immediately off my TBR
Yeah, see,
in
that's
one
I've
go.
got Akatar on my shelf.
It's on my list. I've read her other books.
Yeah, it's on my list. It was on my list for ages. I picked up the first book and read it in a day, and then I started the second one, and I am 300 pages in, and I've been 300 pages in since February.
I don't know if I'm gonna like it. That's the reason I've not picked it up, basically, because I read Throne of Glass. I started reading Throne of Glass when I was quite young, because I read it when the first book when it came out, and I read almost the whole series. I still have to read the last one because there was such a gap between me reading
Yeah.
the second to last and then the last one coming out that I had moved past it in a way where I didn't feel like I could go back to it. Still haven't got there yet. And I just don't. As much as I sort of was like, I did enjoy Throne of Glass, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like it, and I'm not ready to find out yet. I will eventually.
I don't blame you. Yeah, I'm struggling, so it's still on my TBR, and it's still there. It'll stay there until I finally admit defeat or I read them all.
Yeah, it's that's one of those series that I'm almost like, it almost doesn't matter if I like it or not when I do come to read it. I've heard so much about it, I almost need to find out if I'm in the group of people who like it or in the group of people who hate it. I need to know.
Yeah, it's difficult.
But yeah, so slight tangent away from, Regency classic Pride and Prejudice down the Akatar route. But what is the fourth book that you'd be taking with you to
My
your
fourth book
island?
is Circe by Madeline Miller. I was going to say The Song of Achilles, but for some reason Circe just talked to me more. Her character and her character arc was so painful and violent that I read the book. It was one of those books that I picked up and I read in a single sitting, and I stayed up until 3:00 in the morning on a work night to finish. And I cried, I laughed, and I felt actual physical pain for her. So I had to put that on my list because it's one that I know I could reread probably multiple times.
I have the audiobook on my Audible, which I've made a vow to myself that basically I'm going to read as much of my actual TBR of books that I actually own by the end of this year, and then I'm going to have to make some kind of ruthless choices at the end of the year, because there are books that I've owned for probably. I mean, we're getting towards the decade point and still haven't been read, so I feel
Yeah,
like
I've got a few like that actually.
yeah, it gets to the point where I need to make a decision about whether it's going to happen or not. But Circe has been one that's been on my. I mean, it's because Madeline Miller she has got such. I mean, her books are so well loved by so
And
many
she's only
people.
written 2.
Exactly, and there's 2 of them. Like Circe and like Song of Achilles are just some of the books that like people bring up again and again and again. And considering she's only written 2 books, it's amazing that she has the
Yeah.
following that she does, really, because like usually it takes some people writing many books, some of which maybe aren't as good as some of the other books before they get that. And she kind of I've not read either of them, and again, it's one of those I need to know whether I'm.
Yeah, they are books that I think they are so full of really powerful emotions.
Yeah.
And that is something that really sticks with you. I think the thing that's really sad is, unfortunately, she got COVID and she's suffering from long COVID.
Yeah.
So the book, I think she was writing an adaptation of The Tempest. And then as she was writing that, she got inspiration for the story of Persephone.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of myths that I absolutely love, and Persephone's is one of them. So I've got a book that arrived today that I'm going to read that is the story of Persephone from a different perspective, but I am still avidly waiting for hers, so I know it's going to be a considerable period of time, because I think there was 6 years between the Song of Achilles and Circe anyway. I think one came out in 2012 and the other in 2018.
Yeah. See, it's things like that that like make the craft of writing so sort of it's so mysterious to me, because I'm not a writer myself, but I find it fascinating because different authors come at it so completely differently. And I mean, there are authors who produce obviously like amazing books in basically no time at all, like conveyor belt one after another, and there's other ones that take years and years, and there's like it's just amazing to me that just how it happens, especially because these stories are usually so rich. But yeah, Madeline Miller, Circe is one that I'm intrigued by. Circe, I feel like I need to read a different perspective on her anyway, because my only experience with her myth is her appearance in the Percy Jackson series in the second book.
And she's
She is,
also obviously she's in the Odyssey and,
yeah.
well, the original Odyssey. And I think that she does have a story in Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my only experience of her at the moment is a bad guy, and I almost feel like that's just inevitable, because that's like most women in history. Most powerful women in history are usually in that
Yeah, and
category.
she's also a witch.
Yeah,
So,
so yeah, the W word.
yes,
Um,
exactly.
so I mean, a very diverse set of books so far. I'll be interested
Yeah.
to see what the 5th and final book you cap off this list with is.
The 5th and final book's actually a romance, well, a contemporary romance. And it is a lot of people who know me aren't going to be surprised. It's If You Could Go Anywhere by Paige Toon, because it's my favorite by her. And I remember reading it for the first time when it came out and crying on the bus on the way to work, because it just hit me really, really hard with a situation that I was incredibly familiar with. Essentially, this young girl called Angie, her grandmother dies, and they live in a remote town in Australia where the film Pitch Black was made.
Mm.
and her grandmother dies, and her mother died when she was very young, and she discovers this letter when she goes to get a bottle of wine from the cellar. She discovers this letter that her mother never got the opportunity to send to her father, and she's grown up this in her entire life without knowing anything about her father at all. And she goes on this journey to Italy to meet her real father for the first time. And when she's there, she meets her father's stepson, Alessandro. And it's their story, but it's also a story of found family and learning of your past. So
Sounds good.
it's really, really sad and happy and moving and everything else at the same time. So I had to put that on my list. There was another one that was kind of like, I like this one as well, and I've read it about 20 times, but I'm going to put that on the it didn't quite make it list.
Well, I mean, there's got to be a final decision made, and I mean, a good cathartic cry for
Yeah.
your desert island seems
Well,
like a
there's
good.
2 cathartic cries on that list.
a few cathartic cries along with some emotional roller coasters. A book that makes you cry in public is definitely a has got something powerful going on with it, because I mean, I am very much the kind of person, well, I never used to be the kind of person who cried very often, so when a book could actually make me cry, I always remember being very shocked, because it's words on a page. You feel like it shouldn't be able to have this much
Yeah.
power over you. It should be as simple as, I just stop reading now and I close it and that's it, and it doesn't, and it can't hurt me anymore, and it's never like that.
No, it really isn't. And this one, just because it was a situation, I actually read it, it was on the anniversary of my grandmother's death. So it was probably not the best time to read it. But I didn't realize when I read it for the first time that that was what happened in the book. So it was like kind
Yeah.
of punch to the gut, and ah, that was it on the bus. And I was
Yeah.
just hoping nobody saw me.
Well, it's surprising. I mean, I'm not a great believer in, I suppose, fate or destiny, but at the same time, I sometimes do think that people stumble on the right story at the right time in their lives. And I've had that a few times where I've spoken about books with people, and something like they've just picked up a book and they don't know why they've picked it up, or it's crossed their path and they've started reading it at a particular time, usually when something, I mean, possible, like very sad or difficult or momentous has happened, and they didn't know that that was something that had also happened in the book. And I just think it's one of the great things about reading or being a reader, because they talk about reading being able to, you know, impart empathy, and it's something that people learn from when they read. But I think you learn a lot about yourself and your own emotions and how you feel about the world through
Absolutely.
reading other people's stories, fictional or fact. So yeah, it's a really great. I always find it fascinating to just hear about things like that. You got to speak to the author of this book.
I did indeed. Yeah, it was. I was nervous as anything. And she is, it was kind of a bucket list interview, where you get the chance to speak to somebody who you've been reading for. I've been reading her book since 2007 when her first one came out. And I got the chance to speak with her because her new book came out on the 27th of April in the UK and the 25th in the US. So it was talking about that, but also talking about her other books, her inspiration and everything. And I overran just a little bit.
I bet it was an amazing experience, though. Was it? I've never had the opportunity to speak to one of my favorite authors, but I
Me
sometimes
neither.
think I sometimes wonder what it would be like. Was it? I mean, was it everything? I'm sure the answer is yes, but was it everything you thought it was going to be?
It was really nice because I mean, I've spoken with authors before, as most people who do this kind of thing have. They've spoken with either aspiring writers or they've spoken with indie authors, and they've got their own ideas on writing. So I normally just sit there and I have the questions, and it was quite nice to ask a few questions and then just hear her thoughts behind the origin of the characters and everything else, because everyone's origin character origins are different. So
Mm.
getting the chance to speak with her and find out where her inspiration came from and the ideas for the book and how she actually writes. She writes her books in 3 months.
Wow. I mean,
Which was like, whoa, I take that long to write an essay.
yeah. What I mean, that is impressive. Yeah, amazing. Getting to hear, I suppose, the thought process behind some of your favorite sort of characters and stories must be just amazing.
And to
So,
find out which one was her favorite and also which authors, which characters she would like to see made into a TV series or a film and things like that. And it was nice to get the opportunity to ask those questions because they're the sort of things you often wonder. And when she did this on the evening before launch, she did a chat with Lindsay Kelk, and all these people were asking these questions, but there were over 100 people with
mm,
30 minutes of question time, and I had
yeah,
a full hour.
amazing. Well, that's, I mean, like I said, a very diverse but really interesting list of books. For the benefit of listeners, would you mind just recapping all 5 of them in case they're, making a quick Amazon wish list?
Okay, well, the first one is The Changeover by Margaret Mahy. The second, Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. The third is the classic Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I've got Jane Eyre on the brain. The fourth one is Circe by Madeline Miller. And the fifth, If You Could Go Anywhere by Paige Toon.
Awesome. And you mentioned that there was some books that very nearly made it onto your list but didn't quite. Um, what were some of your honorable mentions that didn't quite make it?
Well, the first one I wasn't sure if I was allowed to have, so I didn't put it, and that was one that you really wouldn't like, and it's my Norton's complete works of Shakespeare, because I actually enjoy Shakespeare because I'm weird.
I do too, some of them.
See, I loved King Lear and Coriolanus, Hamlet, Macbeth. The Tempest is one of my favorites. I'm not massively keen on his romance. I really don't like Troilus and Cressida. Not a huge fan of Romeo and Juliet, which I
Yeah.
think is not a romance at all. So but I
Well,
loved studying it.
Well, yeah, because he's got his historicals, his tragedies, and comedies. So it's funny,
Yes.
you like many of the ones that I had a love hate relationship with in high school. So I have had to go back and retry Hamlet and Macbeth because they were taught to me in a way that was painful in school. But my absolute favorite Shakespeare play, which I've seen multiple times, both live, I've listened to audio versions, is Much Ado About Nothing, because I really love his comedy.
See, I went and
um,
saw Hamlet multiple times, one of which was with Eleanor Bron and Alan Cumming.
ooh.
Alan Cumming played Hamlet.
Well, would you say he was your favorite person playing Hamlet?
And well, I don't know if he'd be my favorite, but he was. I mean, he was very good, and he also had it was a part of the Royal Shakespeare tour back in 1994, I think. So it was before he became really well known for anything that he's done. So Goldeneye and all the
Yeah.
other things that he's done since. It was way before that.
Well, the way I've been trying to re-experience some of the Shakespeare that I didn't like the first time round is the BBC audio adaptations that they have on Audible, basically,
Yeah.
that have the sort of full cast, and then it's like a full production, and then I read it alongside listening to it because I find the intonation helps me a little bit more with the understanding. um, and yeah, Hamlet, I definitely enjoyed more reading it for myself, similar to you with Pride and
Yeah.
Prejudice. So yeah, no, I don't dislike Shakespeare. You were quite right, though. You wouldn't have been allowed the full Shakespeare. We've had attempts to smuggle it in the past, and people were forced to pick their favourites that they can only
Yeah,
take.
it's very,
Um,
very difficult. I also was lucky enough to see Patrick Stewart play Malvolio in Twelfth Night,
ooh,
which was
Patrick Stewart.
another superb performance.
Yeah, so the BBC adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing had David Tennant as Benedict, which, I mean, I adore David Tennant. He is perfect in everything. And Benedict is my absolute favourite character in that. So for me, I was like quite happy. That, for me, that is the version in my head that I will always return to now. So I'm quite glad that there's an easily accessible version of it. But what would you say if you had to pick a favourite?
If I had to pick a favourite, it would be Hamlet, because I've
Yeah.
seen that so many times on the stage in so many different places. I saw it at the National, I saw it at the Theatre Royal, I saw it at the Connaught Theatre, my local theatre in town, and that's where I saw the version with Alan Cumming and Eleanor Bron, and Eleanor Bron was superb as Queen Gertrude. So it was a very interesting and enlightening experience. And my family was, why are you going to see that? You've seen it 4 times.
It's different every that's the great thing. Shakespeare, I find that, because I mean, I've seen multiple productions of Taming of the Shrew, which is not one I particularly enjoy a great deal, but I find most companies bring something different to it. Even I've seen the same show by the Royal Shakespeare Company multiple times, and they always put a slightly different spin or a slightly different take on it, and I always find that is interesting, even if I'm not a huge fan of the original play that it's from. So yeah, I think that's Hamlet again is another one that it's well loved on the podcast. It has been selected a couple of times because it's very good. It's very good. I wish I'd been taught it by a better teacher.
I was taught it by an English teacher called Mr. Harley, and he was an English teacher, but he was also a drama teacher, so it was taught slightly differently.
Yeah, my A-level teacher who taught us Hamlet had a definite bias towards literary fiction, and I think because of his own lack of enthusiasm about Shakespeare, was not very good at making us enthusiastic about Shakespeare. So yeah, Hamlet. Well, all of Shakespeare, but Hamlet. If you had to pick one,
Yeah, if I had to pick,
what are the honorable mentions?
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams.
One of my favourites.
Fantastic. I mean, it's a shame that you can't take the entire collection, even though mine's all in one book.
Same.
Another one is To the Moon and Back by Jill Mansell, because it's yet another very, very similar to If You Could Go Anywhere that just makes you cry. And it's a book that I've read multiple times. It's one of the only, my niece managed to leave school having never read an entire book. And I've never been able to understand how she A, managed it, and B, why she'd want to do that, but she did. And then I loaned her my Kindle with To the Moon and Back on it, and she read the whole book. So that's one book, one bonus for that one. But it's also a really good, very, very moving love story, I suppose. And then my final pick is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Nice, big, thick, chunky book, but also fantastically written.
Yeah, I have rediscovered my love for the big, chunky book, because there was a time in my reading when I was like, I just want something that I can finish in, like, you know, a couple days or like a week at most, and I don't want to go for the really book. And then I got to reread some, you know, big, lengthy 1,000-page ones. I was like, oh, you just don't get the same experience sometimes from a smaller book. But American Gods it's on the list. Honestly, this list is endless. It really
Well, if we can move Good Omens up the list a little bit, and
yes.
Circe as well, I think both of those move up the list a little bit.
They are 100% closer to the top than many other books because I actually own them, and therefore they get priority at the moment. I am on the strictest and longest book buying ban I have been on for a very long time. Mainly because I've got new incentive because I need to move house in a month or two, and I'm already daunted by the concept of moving the books that I currently own. So I think the ban's gonna last as long as I take to move, and then once I'm in the new house and have a new address to give to all of the bookstores to deliver stuff, I'm probably gonna end up breaking. Plus, I'll have my new bookshelves, so
exactly. You'll need to fill them.
Exactly, I will have to. You have to buy them new books, otherwise they get upset. So, those are your 5 books and your honorable mentions, books that you love. If people wanted to hear more recommendations from you and more about books that you love and hear some author interviews, where might they be able to find you in this big wide world?
In this big wide world, they can find me on my website, where I also have my podcast updated there every week, as well as book reviews, and that is beingbookish.co.uk. So I release a podcast episode at a very random time of 13 minutes past midnight BST every Monday morning. And in that, I tend to do a single book review that is 100% spoiler free, and essentially look at mostly not popular books, but books that you can get very, very easily. So I like to pick something of a different genre every single week, because I think that if you just read, I used to do a romance podcast, and if you just did romance every single week, I'd personally get bored with doing that myself. But at the same time, I know that everybody likes different genres, and I like to introduce myself to something different occasionally too.
Yeah, that's great. So definitely go and check Raye out on the website and on listen to the podcast, because as you can tell, she's full of amazing recommendations.
Thank you.
If you wanted to follow this podcast on socials, it's at BooksClassPod on Instagram, because I mean we're also on Twitter at the same handle, but it is not being used for various reasons. So Instagram's the main place, so at BooksClassPod, and yeah, follow the podcast wherever podcasts are found, wherever you found it on this particular listen. It is also available on YouTube. So Raye, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been
my
so
absolute pleasure.
I feel like I've probably talked to you for hours and hours on end about books, but unfortunately, I'm sure you have very many things to do with the rest of your evening.
It's mostly reading books, funnily enough.
And I couldn't possibly keep you from it. So, until next time, listeners, thank you very much for listening, and bye for now.